Hi, I'm Kerrie Penney, and on this episode of Secret Heart Broadcasting, I'll be speaking with Janine Violini. Janine and Jamie Whittaker run a program called Crows in a Row, and what they do is educate people about the impermanence of life and planning for the inevitable end. So if you have questions about wills, or letting people know what your wishes are when you're gone, or you even want to start having those conversations, then this episode is for you. Hi, welcome to the show today, and I am so thrilled to be speaking to Janine Violini, who's co-founder, along with Jamie Whittaker, of Crows in a Row. Janine and I are going to have a conversation about thanatology, for one thing, which is the study of death and dying and bereavement, and just embracing the idea, I think, today that life is impermanent and beautiful and wonderful. And it's beautiful and wonderful because it's impermanent, or those are my thoughts anyway. Janine, welcome to the program. I'm so glad you said yes.
Thank you, Kerrie. To talk to you about anything is wonderful, but to talk to you about death, dying, and bereavement is just the best thing ever.
I am so curious about how it is. Oh, by the way, full disclosure, Janine and I met years ago in studying with Sarah Kerr about death, dying, and bereavement. And I came late to this party, but you had always this like a confidence and just this naturalness around the conversation. And I'm wondering, is there, in your background, how did you come to be so okay with the study of death, dying, and bereavement?
We'll talk about sort of the training that I did, and early on, my colleague Jamie Whittaker and we started studying got certificates in thanatology through Centennial College, and one of the first exercises we had to do in the first semester was review your life and look at the first 5 deaths that were impactful for you. And I realized that for me, most of them had come before the age of 10. So, and I just thought that was normal, which for many people it is, and tragically for many people in the world today, it's far beyond that. But in typical Western culture, it was a bit unusual, I learned. And so I think it was just having a large extended family. A lot of death happens, a lot of birth happens, a lot of death happens. And so probably that's where the comfort came from. And then really had begun doing the work and the studying and the training from about 2009 or so. Certainly with my parents' death, 1999, 2007, those were sort of transformational moments for me. But I think started the studying and everything in 2009. So probably when we met, I was pretty okay with it.
Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering culturally, like you are second generation Canadian and your family is of Italian heritage. And, maybe I'm making assumptions, but I would think you have, so much ritual around all the life transitions, birth and marriage and dying. Do you think that played into your ability to just kind of sit with this conversation and, educate people?
For sure. I think probably more than anything, a lot of immigrants would have left many family behind. So they may not have had the same experience as I did. But because I'm second generation and because my dad came with his brother and big families, my grandfather came with his brother, and then big families, my dad's brother married my mom's sister, so a lot of extended family in the mix. And like I say, when death happened, we had pretty traditional ritual around Catholic practice. I'm no longer Catholic, but that was sort of my upbringing. But it was more around the grief, and this was, I believe, a skill that my parents and my family taught me very early on. From my first remembered uncle's death, I was about the age of 3, and I can remember the grief in the house, and I got very comfortable with grief, I think.
I'm curious about, in that culture growing up, is it common to have an open coffin where people will at the funeral come by and just have the acknowledgement that, wow, the person I knew is no longer there?
For the Catholic tradition, it's during the prayers, the evening before the funeral is when the coffin is open or the casket is open, and people come by and sort of say their last goodbyes to the body. And then the next day at the funeral, it's a more formal religious ceremony, and the coffin is or casket is closed then.
Okay. And in my family, on my mom's side, they're Ukrainian Orthodox originally, but Ukrainian Catholic later. It's common to have an open coffin actually at the funeral, and that with the idea that I remember my mother telling me that, you can see that the spirit is no longer in the body, and I thought that was interesting, and I offered that opportunity to my daughter. I don't know how to say that, but we certainly went to an aunt's funeral when she was about 9, and I thought, yeah, it's time that she had that education experience. I mean, it feels so harsh talking about it now, but I think somewhere in there, it's important to be able to just start grasping the impermanence of life on earth.
For sure. I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think too, what for myself, I often speak to the comment so we, again, lots of aunts and uncles living close by had one of my uncles lived across the lane from us, and he died in May very suddenly of a heart attack. And lots of commotion around that. My grandmother, my nonna, was making sure that myself and my other sister, the youngest kids, were staying in the house while everybody was running across the alley and the ambulance was coming. So there's a lot of fear around that. Like, I didn't know what was going on. There was lots of obviously crying and emotion. And then, as I understood and we learned over the days coming, my cousins came. My dad went and got my cousins. They were teenage at that time, and he brought them to our house to tell them. And being a witness to all of that was such an important part of my learning. And then when the funeral came, my parents said I would go to the funeral, but not to the prayer service, and sort of that was a big thing for me because. I wanted to see his dead body. I was curious at that age. I was still 5. I was about to be turning 6. And because all of my family and my cousins were all older than me, there was always talk about seeing the dead body and did you touch him or did you? And there's so much curiosity around that when you're young, when you don't know, and when you're not in it. That curiosity, I think, becomes fear. And so I love that you invited your daughter to make that choice because I think everybody is different at different times. I felt very ready. My parents didn't. And so I sort of stomped around the house during a tantrum saying, I'm going to be 6 and I've never seen a dead body. And how will I show my face? And, again, that lack of understanding, but that understanding came out of curiosity and being able to talk to my sister about it and then learn more about it. And, eventually the fear, very, very soon after the fear disappeared. And again, as I said, in my family, just based on size, it wasn't very long after that I was able to go to a funeral and a prayer service with an open casket.
I loved what you said about curiosity unexplored becoming fear.
Mm-hmm.
That just feels particularly resonant.
Yeah, just what comes to mind. One of my first death cafes was I was sitting at a table. You're just sitting in groups of people you don't know, and one person there said, oh yes, I just went to my first funeral, and she said I'm 73 or 74, like mid 70s, and I thought. And she said, and it was my father, and I was so afraid, and I my heart just melted. I thought, 76 years of fear around, like growing fear around what will it be like. And so, in those moments for me, and not everybody would be grateful for this, but I felt so much gratitude around being exposed to it at such a young age.
Yeah, even having this conversation is interesting and important because I think, people want to avoid having this conversation. We don't want to talk about death. And just even the perception, death is viewed as somehow you lost. There's winners and losers, and the winners are the living. I think to fully embrace life, we have to be mindful that there's an end.
For sure. There's so many great teachers that I've had and learned from, whether they were authors that I read or whomever. But even having all this exposure and sort of where Jamie and I came to doing the work that we do, it wasn't really until I did the deep dive and my own work, so to speak, through those 5 semesters of hard study, that I realized how much richer my life had become when I was able to integrate death daily, in my thoughts, in my words, and in all that I do. That feeling of impermanence is different than the knowing of impermanence. I think hard to explain, but it's another sort of sideways comparison is. I'm still working in the corporate world in my day job, and I've let everybody know that I'll be retiring at 65, which is 1 year, 10 months, 1 day from now. And and so we all joke about my countdown. And the thing I don't say out loud is I do this because A, I love Excel formulas, but B, because I know there is another countdown happening. I just don't know what that time period is. But every time I talk about my retirement countdown, it pops into mind. Yeah, there's another one happening, and this day becomes richer. My conversation with you becomes more important. My saying goodbye to Tim in the morning on my way out becomes more important. All of those things matter more.
Yeah, I think I've experienced that too, getting older, and I haven't been as consciously living and certainly studying thanatology the way you have. But just that realization that, yeah, life is precious, and losing. Yeah, when you talk about losing someone, when you start to lose people who you love, and for me, my big and most important death, as you know, was my mother. It just changed everything, right? It was my crucible. I'm a way better person, for one thing. And I'm a more compassionate person.
Oh, yeah. I like to think I am. I sure hope I am.
You are.
Yeah. It changed everything when I started doing the work. At that time I was teaching at SAID. I became a different teacher in the classroom. I became a different life partner to my husband, a different auntie. Oh my God, did that change night and day? A different sister, a different everything. Every part of my being was different.
So, how were you changed? And I guess at some level, there's a universal experience of when a human loses someone that they love dearly, we are changed. And it's not only in negative ways. Like, I
Right.
mean, certainly grief, we'll talk about that. But how were you changed? You talked about this changing relationship with your, nieces or nephews, for example. How did you change?
Yeah. I guess I would say that the gravity of responsibility in the short time we have. So while I always felt I was auntie. I didn't have any kids of my own. Have 11 nieces and nephews, 11 great nieces and nephews that I just adore every one of them. I started to wonder, did they know how much I adored them? And and the answer was no, because I was busy being me in life, and so I really made it a conscious effort to make sure they knew that. I think it's 22 people. I don't know if I've been successful all the way around, but I'm getting there, and hopefully I'll have time to complete that. The other thing was, I think, much more practice around remembering the ancestors. So I went through a 6-year period where I started just briefly thinking to myself, okay, my nieces and nephews don't know my aunts and uncles. And so I'm the youngest of the generation. And so with that comes, I feel, a great responsibility to carry memory. And so I started with just a few of my nieces and nephews on my email list and said, on the death days or birthdays of my aunts and uncles, I would share a story about them that I remembered or that I knew of, just to acknowledge them. And soon the list grew, and the things I talked about, I think, were very important for my nieces and nephews. They certainly commented that way. Cousins asked to be added. Some came on, some dropped off. It was a bit too much for some, and absolutely, loads of compassion for that. But yeah, so it brought me closer to my nieces and nephews by introducing them to their ancestors, and the hopes that someday I'll be a good one. And then I often remember one time in the classroom, I had the great privilege of working with many Indigenous, some of our First Nations bands teaching at SAID. And I remember one day I was just starting a new 6-week program, Microsoft training, and I had a group from Tsuut'ina, and I started the day by saying, how many of you are currently in active grief, knowing that there is, again, because they're so close in community, that is so prevalent. And out of 14 students, I think 11 hands went up. And so pretty tough to learn 6 hours straight a day for 6 weeks of Microsoft when there's that much active grief in the room. And so, we just had a LED candle. We talked about the waves of grief, making sure that people had permission to come and go out of the room, come back to it. So yeah, I think it made me a better teacher.
I feel like we're coming at so many waves of such important information already. So, so we kind of scooted ahead to the better people we are once we've moved through grief. But I think the story you just shared, like how many people are dealing with active grief, and that's a thing. Like we're expected to somehow just, oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. See you at work on Tuesday. So let's talk a little bit about grieving and how, good Lord, that happened. Like everyone grieves. It doesn't matter how strong you are. Everybody grieves a loss. And we don't have maybe the tools to do it.
For sure. I love your the way you're speaking about it in the workplace, but there's so much grief over so many things. If we just look at the energy of grief that would be in our country right now, with all uh, the beautiful Ukrainian grief that is here, and I call it beautiful because it's there to show up and show us, wake up. Wake up. Not only wake up to the world the way it is, but wake up to how lucky you are to be where you are with your people, and to not know what's happening on the other side of the world and to your family. And I believe that energy is so present for all of us. And I think for myself, if I think that I can disconnect from that for even a minute, I feel I'm being foolish. And so just really trying to remember that and honor it with a deep reverence is part of my practice. It doesn't necessarily heal anyone or anything, but it certainly makes me more aware. And I liken it to, my grandmother left Italy, my mom's mom, when she was 19, and never saw her mother again. And I was thinking how, our family, we have so few photographs in our family, and my grandmother had a little canister about this tall and wide, and those were her pictures. That's all she had with her when she came, because she brought one trunk. And so for my playtime with my nonna, because she lived with us, would be, oh, let's go open your canister. I loved the way it opened. And we'd look at all the pictures. She'd tell me who everybody was. And I didn't realize in those moments that she was grieving not being with them. And, she did get to go back in 1962, the year I was born, but her mom had already died then. And so for each of us, when we had our time to go back to Italy, we felt that grief. We walked into her house. Every one of us went at different times. There's 5 kids in my family. We each went on different trips, and we all had the exact same experience. When you walked over the threshold of the home that my grandmother grew up in and stayed in until she was 19, the tears just flowed. It's like this connection to that separation. And so, I feel like grief is so present.
Honestly, there's so many questions going through my head right now. Like we've spoken about Death Cafe. We spoke about your business partner, Jamie. We've spoken about, grieving in the workplace. I want to ask a question about ritual. That my head is just humming. maybe we should do is take it right back to the beginning and talk about Crows in a Row. Like I've introduced you as the co-founder of Crows in a Row, and we didn't even talk about what does Crows in a Row mean.
Absolutely, yeah. I guess really the moment was at my mom's funeral. So when she died, it was I would say an expected death. She had dementia, Alzheimer's. She had been suffering with congestive heart failure. She was 88 beautiful years, and the last 6 months were for sure a challenge. We didn't really know a lot about palliative care. This was 2006. There was like one palliative nurse in Calgary at the time, so really didn't know what we were doing. But at the time of her death, we had a lot of time. All my siblings and I were spending time caring for my mom in those final weeks and months. And you'd think we would have talked about her funeral, but we didn't. We all knew exactly what we wanted. It wasn't necessarily the same thing, though. And so, after she died, we were like, oh yeah, we're going to do this. We are. Did we talk about that? So anyway, it was a lovely funeral. It would, all the cousins and friends and family came. It was community grieving. It was what a funeral should be, healing. But after it was done, I did the Janine thing where it's like, oh, can't believe I didn't do that. Oh, and so at the time, throughout my career, I've done a lot of work in event planning, and at that time, Jamie and I were teaching at SAIT together, and event planning was one of our specialties. and so I kept thinking, there's got to be more to event planning than corporate events. I need to help people plan funerals, because even when you're prepared and you have time to think about it, there's so many things I would have done differently. And so that's kind of how we started. We said we were going to, put the fun back in funeral and help people plan funerals. And so from my perspective, that was a true feeling. Like by fun, I didn't mean there's no grief. By fun, I meant that there's ways to remember people. So one of the misses that I thought we had at my mom's funeral, everybody knew her garden was so important to her and she loved tomatoes. Why did we not have baby tomatoes for everybody to take home? And the smell of tomatoes in the room would have been like when she was harvesting, so simple things like that. Or, my mom worked as she was on the shirt press at a laundromat before she got married, and she loved that job. And then she taught each of us to iron well and to do it with such loving care, because that's what she did for my dad. And so, maybe a takeaway would have been, hey, everybody, this week, iron a shirt for someone you love and think of Lena. And so simple things like that I call fun. um, and so anyway, Jamie and I took to starting with friends and family and saying, okay, let's sit together. And if your funeral happened tomorrow, what would we do? What would you want? How would you want to be remembered? And so we worked with quite a few people in those early days. And the feedback we were getting is, having that conversation, I actually need to quit my job, or I need to change how I'm living, because when I think about how I want to be remembered, I'm not living the life I want to live. And so we realized that was sort of the tweak to, oh, there's more to this. And then, we started the studies, and then, like I say, everything changed from there for ourselves. Then we, met with Sarah Kerr, learned all about home funerals, and did some beautiful work in workshops there of the whole study of home funeral and how to care for our dead, and then the learning just continued from there. When we sort of finished our certificates in thanatology, a lot of the requests we were getting at that time, we had been hosting death cafes, which is a social franchise started in Switzerland, and the psychologist or sociologist who started it said, I just want people to be able to go for coffee and talk about death just like they go for coffee and talk about life. And so it's a wonderful premise. And so you have to follow specific guidelines, group directed conversation, that kind of thing. And so as Jamie and I were hosting over the years, first few years anyway, most of the comments we were getting back is, oh, I actually thought we were going to get information. But that's one of the guidelines for calling it a death cafe, is you can't provide information. It has to be group directed conversation. And so we realized there was a very big need for people to come and learn about, what do I need to know about a funeral? Why do I have to have a will? Why, like all the pragmatic pieces. So that led us to building a program, and it's a 6-topic, 6-module, whatever you want to call it, program. We talk about funerals. We talk about what to do with your remains. We talk about all the paperwork. We talk about digital assets and what to do with that, legacy, what that could mean, and the written word. How will you be remembered in written word? And so those 6 topics come as a full package. They can come as, where we might speak to a family who only wants to talk about the paperwork. So it's really the pragmatic, logistical pieces around death. And often we find that's the door to the depth. And so if somebody's very, pretty comfortable talking about wills, because it's a very much more common topic in the world, or Western culture, I should say. So that's an easy in. And then, they might start to dig deeper, and then that's where the depth comes from. But for our program, we kept thinking, what are we going to call it? Like, yeah, it is, getting your paperwork and you're getting your ducks in a row, but that's, blah, blah, blah. and then we were in Seattle, Jamie and I and my husband, Tim, and we were, of course, at a week-long, it was for work at the time for teaching, but there was a week-long art show going on for death and dying, which we were so excited about. And so we were in the cemetery this one day, and there was these three or four crows sitting in a row, in a line. And I just said to Jamie, I go, oh, the crows in a row. That's what we should call it. She said, yeah, that's what we should call it. And so that's what it became.
So not ducks in a row, the crows in a row.
Yeah. And of course, because of their great teachings around crow funerals, and even just the way they are in sort of general culture, pop culture, the horror movies they're in, and often their association with the darkness of death. And we really believe that is the beauty of death. My favorite, I have many favorite crow stories, but one of my favorites is Theo Mitchell, one of our first people that we really cared for in his dying time. I had slept over the night before he died, and he used to love to talk to the crows. He was 96 years old, and he would bend down on the street, crossing the street, and he'd talk, and he'd chirp, 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 chirp with the crows, and they'd come and see him because we know they have face recognition. Anyway, the morning he died, I got up, and on their little balcony was this crow, and he just sat there all morning with us. And so I think that's my miracle of the crow coming to tell us these are your final hours. And so I have a picture of ravens somewhere on my desk there today that I inherited from Theo, and he's got great little stories he wrote out behind the picture that he pasted on there.
Oh, I love that. Wow, there's so much in what you just said. And it's almost like a work back schedule. Like if you can see life as impermanent,
Yeah.
and we don't know the date, but working back and seeing all the things we need to plan, and also the person we need to be, right? Like making peace with who you are and still striving for who you want to be. Is that part of it?
Absolutely, for sure. Like I didn't even, I was unaware that I wasn't the auntie I wanted to be until I started to think about my aunties who were ancestors now. Had a beautiful experience in one of our meditations in Sarah's sessions, where we got to speak to someone as though they were an ancestor. And I said, do you miss touching us? Because I miss hugging my aunties so much. And the answer I got back, or heard back in my heart, was, every time you hug your nieces, you hug us all the way back, all the way back, all the way back. And so, sorry, that makes me cry every time I say it. But yeah, so now when I hug my nieces, I just feel Auntie Mary, Auntie Talia, all of them, yeah, with us, yeah, and all the ones I don't know, yeah.
So this ancestor piece, and you and I both studied with Sarah Kerr, who was a fantastic and generous teacher. But this idea that we don't walk alone was I kind of knew that before I studied with Sarah and with you in that group, but I absolutely knew that when, certainly when that work was over for me and when my mom died. It's like she's with me in a different way, which means that all the ancestors are with us in a different way, right? We carry, the energy moves forward and we're that point in time while we're alive on the earth. That's what I think.
I think so too. And for me, things are becoming less and less linear. So that's what I'm loving about the conversation, right? It's like, am I alive now? Is my mom alive now? Like, where are the layers of that? How does existence really work? I love that kind of thinking and that curiosity, but for sure, whether I will never know if that any of that is scientifically true, but I can tell you I'm a better person because I believe that. So when I have specific earrings that weren't from my grandmother, but they remind me of her, and so when I have a day where I need her to be with me, and what is it that I'm needing is that I have one image of her where we would walk across the schoolyard to the corner store and I would be holding her hand, and I felt so special. And, and when I was sending out the messages to all my cousins, because she had many, many grandchildren, they all said, "Oh, she did this." And I felt so special. And I was like, darn, I thought I was the special one.
I was the
But
most special.
I was the most special. And so I would picture that and say, I am special. And, I might need those ear. I need you there. I need your voice. I need your whatever. And I feel it there. Yeah.
I am wearing this bracelet that it was my mother's bracelet, and she bought it in Saskatoon in, probably the early 50s at Burke's Jewelers. And she had to put down money. She had just had her first job and she had to make 4 payments. She was so, enamored of this bracelet, which is so beautiful. But when I want to have her with me, I wear that.
Yeah.
And certainly, no one loved me like she loved me. Like, we get all this different kind of love in our life. And yeah. Okay, we're kind of into the realm of, what we believe. And when you're doing the work with crows in a row and someone comes to you and says, I think, should we have a will? You were talking about that being an entry point, but yeah, I guess my question is, we should all have a will, right?
Yeah, yeah. So most of our work when we're doing the Crows in a Row program as it stands is storytelling. So for us, I mean, you can go to any lawyer, and many are so wonderful. There's many we recommend, and we always recommend you go to one after us. But call sort of our work in it beyond the paperwork. So it's we I would say it's not like we invented any of this. Death has been happening, I think, for a little bit now, and
This
and
just
so
in.
yeah, exactly. And so, of course, there's great wise teachers all throughout history who've done death well. And for Jamie and I, it's just a reminder for people who maybe haven't had that exposure to look at things slightly differently. Lucy Kalanithi is Dr. Lucy Kalanithi. Her husband, Paul, had the book When Breath Becomes Air, and he died young as a doctor, and she finished the book. She has a beautiful TED Talk, and one of her lines in the TED Talk is, the paperwork, it's the hard, it's hard stuff, but it's the stuff. And she spoke to it about being a renewal of vows, like, will you speak for me when I can no longer speak for myself? Will you make sure that my legacy or anything that I earned monetarily or materialistically in this world is given to the places where I want it to go? And will you be my spokesperson? And so I think when we approach the paperwork from both the honor and privilege that it is to be able to say, I'm asking for this care. I'm asking for you to care for me in this way, for the documents when you're alive, the power of attorney and the personal directive, to be able to say, this is how I want to die. And this is how I want to be cared for if I can't speak for myself. And then after death in this way. And I think to be asked is an honor and a privilege, but to be able to say yes or no based on your capacity is also as important. And, one of the spoke of Theo Mitchell and his wife, Catherine, who was my grade 10 biology teacher, and met up with her again at the hair salon, which kind of was wonderful. And also, am I going to a hair salon where an 80-year-old? Yes, I am, because it was a great hair salon. Anyway, we met up again, and she was very nervous about their dying time because they didn't have any kids of their own. And they Catherine was, who's gonna be the person speaking for me, and so she put Jamie and I through some rigorous training, I'll tell you, and so understanding that paperwork every year on Theo's birthday, there were 6 of us on Team Catherine, we called it, and she would say, are you still able and willing to stand for me as my agent on my personal directive? Are you? And we would commit as a vow. And it was just a different take on the paperwork that says we are in community and we will care for one another. And it becomes a beautiful, I think, a beautiful way of saying how much you matter to me, before we die. And so the paperwork, I think, can take quite a shift from I hate doing this to, oh my gosh, this is sacred work.
What's the biggest obstacle to that you're experiencing when people, like, why don't they want to talk about it, right? And I know people who have died without a will, or family who have lost a parent whom they loved dearly, and it was like, no, she didn't want a funeral. Like, no one. What is that? What is that obstacle?
Yeah, I think fear for sure. So maybe they didn't have the opportunities to see it done in a way that is healing and beautiful. I think that's probably the biggest thing. Of course, society's, you know, real effort to make us want to live forever and not see death. Lots of history around how embalming came to be, how all of those things came to be. And so even, in the hospital, you might see, like when my dad died in 1999, again, so different from how I would do it now. But it's like, okay, we've unplugged the machines. Yes, we're doing a one-time resuscitation. All of that has changed our family so much, just in our choices of how we would want to die. But then being sort of whisked away, instead of being in the room telling the stories, we'd go in one at a time, as he wasn't awake. He had a massive heart attack and lived for about 2 to 3 days. And then, we would take turns going in, instead of it being, my dad was such a family guy in the kitchen. We should have all been there eating salami. And, and so I'm not judging myself. It's just that learning. I guess that's what I'm trying to say is it takes time to learn this. You have to see it differently before you can adapt or change or have a different mind shift. So I think in our work, it's to show people there's a different way, and they'll only see it when they're ready to see it. I just wanted to circle back to, you made me think of one thing you said right at the beginning about this failure, death as a failure, battle language used around it. My mom she used to say to me, she'd love it when if I said, oh, I think I failed my test today. Oh, thank God, she'd say. And I never really understood that until now. And it's like, I was lucky to have a lot of success in my life. And she'd say, you're never going to learn anything until you fail. You can get 90s all the time, but that doesn't teach you anything about life. And so when I think of that in the context of death, which I believe was probably her message, was that, as long as you are afraid of it and think of it as failing, you'll never really live that holistic life. And so I think in society, whether it's the beauty world now, whether it's the anti-aging world, I think there's a lot to, if I'll steal that word, battle against. And so really, for us, we can change those who are ready to see something different.
I remember when my mom was ill, there was a point for me where I went and I was her fierce advocate, because in the healthcare system, the most invisible person is an old woman, frankly, and she wasn't able to speak, blah, blah, blah. But there was a moment for me when I went from being fierce advocacy, keep her safe, what can I do now, to just, okay, I see where this is going. She is I mean, it maybe wasn't actively dying yet, but it was almost like I just had to step back and say, this is happening now. What is my role to ensure that this death can be as beautiful as possible? And Sarah Kerr helped me very, very much with that. But it was a moment from being avenging angel with my sword to like, something is required of me and I don't know what it is, but it will be the most important work I'm ever going to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Stephen Jenkinson has great words around that, to know where you are in the moment, like to be able to be as present as possible, because that fight that I have to, I have to fix, I have to make this okay. And to then actually turn around and say, this is the teaching. This is the teaching and the learning and all of that. And it's my place. I'm going to, just share something, Kerrie, with you. Our last session with Sarah as a group on council together, you and I were partnered, and we had to look at a stone we had been carrying and see what the message in it was. And you helped me articulate what I think my role is. And I say it, I have it in my Outlook because that's the person I am. But every Friday it pops up and I repeat it, and I think of you. And I printed it out here. I am the reflection of the hidden treasure in each of us and the solid handle you hold on to in the darkest places. I'm ever expanding light and deeply rooted, fertile darkness. And you really helped me see the darkness in that stone and how beautiful it was, and that's my role, is that those hard places. Yeah.
I love that deeply rooted, fertile darkness. I feel so privileged to have had, which I wouldn't have had. Like younger me did not want to talk about death and dying, thought it was a downer, wouldn't have, and all these things that have made me a better person, right? Like the most difficult death I've had in my life so far is my mother's. I didn't think I was going to be able to do it. And now I'm a better person. I met you. I learned to be wise. I learned, I'm not courting death. Like, I'm grateful to have this day
For sure.
every day, but it just, I don't know, made me better. Who would ever guess such a terrible thing would make you a better person?
Yeah. And I just have to think it's about that wholeness, right? It's when you're living a good and happy life, it's half a life. And so it's great. And that's wonderful. And when that door or window starts to open and you see that there's more, then there's a whole life. And that can't match that.
So, do you have any tips for talking about dying with my husband? Right, we do sort of like, oh, when I die, make sure I play this song at my. But to get deeper with that, or even with my daughter, who has this weirdo mom, right? I'm already like, honey, let's talk about. But how can we deepen the conversations so that when it happens, the people left behind aren't like lost or thinking, find a piece of paper months later that said, "Oh, please, whatever you do, don't cremate me." And you've already, like how do we have or lay the groundwork for these kind of conversations so that we're not laying the groundwork for regret?
So first, let's just offer, there will always be regret, and there will be unraveling, and there will be the such remorse. Why didn't I? That's part of that wholeness. And so if we can allow that, and then think, Jamie and I use the word integration a lot. So, a lot of people moving through, we certainly don't use move on. But when we're integrating death and grief into our lives on a daily basis, that might mean you're walking with your husband and you see a dead squirrel. Let's move it over to the side and put a flower by it. Yeah, you know what? I think that I would like somebody to do that for me when I die. And so, like you say, the conversations you're having when I die, please do this. Tim and I, we use the news a lot. We use what's happening in my family a lot. Of course, it's easy to be lighthearted when nothing is imminent, knowing there's a countdown right happening behind me. But, the lighthearted side of it is a good approach for Tim and I. It's like we'll see something that a relative or something that's on the news, and I'm like, if you do that to me, I will come back and kill you,
I'll
So,
haunt you.
yeah. And so, we lighten it up that way. At the same time, as we're going through his mother's aging, as we went through my mother's aging and dying like you did, it was like, oh, I never want this, or I do want this, or what would it mean to not have a burial? Like, so, the next time you go to a funeral, I always use the opportunities that are present. I'm, going to a funeral and I'm seeing something that I love or don't love. Like you said, I hear a song, play this. If nothing else, play this, because it will remind you of this moment. And wherever I am or however I am on the other side, uh, if I hear it, I'll be smiling. If there's no such thing, you'll be smiling. And so that's what matters, And so it's just trying to learn different ways of speaking about it. I always said Tim is adamant, no funeral for me, kind of thing. And so Jamie and I said, don't worry, we'll plan your funeral. And and I said, I think Tim just doesn't want people talking about him, but he doesn't mind if we're talking about his passions. And so he was a chef. He's a retired chef now. And so we said, yeah, I'll need something like where maybe we go for dinner with family and close friends once a month for a few months to help me grieve with them. So we planned this whole thing of what restaurants we'd go to. And then, you could hear Tim stomping down the stairs going, what restaurants are you picking? And what are you doing with, what menu are you giving? So it's where is the other person? Where can you meet them?
Okay, that's so important, because I know people who say, I do not want a funeral. And to me, that ritual is for the people who are left. So, and you never want to, it's like, well, they said they didn't want a funeral. So creating that creative workaround, like taking what the idea of a funeral and make it into a ritual around grieving, is quite lovely. And is it disobeying the person's wishes, though?
Well, I can't not talk about it. So I say, this is what's going to help me heal. And I think it's having that conversation. So, very good example too. My mother-in-law, she's turning 90 next weekend. Yay. And so she's lately been on a big no funeral for me. Great. Okay. That's okay. But, Tim and Shauna and I are going to need something. How would this sound if we, and then I'll suggest something. And then the next time, right now she loves it when you read, she can't see anymore. So I'm reading, Tim bought me the Lonely Planet Guide to Death and Burial Practices, and it's beautiful. So I read her one at like one different cultural practice every week, and we pick something from it that I could do for when she dies. And so for me, coming from a very specific cultural or religious practice, I should say, not cultural, around what you do at a funeral, that didn't work for me most of the time. And it works for many people, and that's great. But what does work for me is that integration, that continuation of ways of remembering. And so, last weekend, my mother and I learned about the relationship of marigolds to death and dying. And we're like, oh, I never really liked marigolds, but now I do. So I'm going to plant a marigold every summer. And on your birthday, I will allow it to die.
What's the relationship between marigolds and dying?
Well, what I learned from it was on the Mexican tradition, of course, Day of the Dead. And so they always have marigold wreaths, and it comes from a story, and I'm sorry, I'm terrible on myth, but it was a woman and a man who died, and the woman died, and she said, make me, have marigolds at my funeral, and I will always come then.
So I love this, taking meaningful things and crafting ritual that is meaningful for the people.
Yes,
Which is possible, right? That was another big learning
absolutely.
for me, as my mom was dying in hospice, and I was so very grateful that we got there somehow. I mean, and at some point in the dying process, there are miracles everywhere. Like,
Everywhere.
it is unbelievable. But we were in this place, this very quiet place without overhead beeping, and yeah, the process became active, but I knew it was like, oh, I should have a picture of her mother and her father. And I know I can't light a candle in this room, but I can use an LED candle. I can use scent. I can have quiet. I can play the kind of music she loved. Like, we could just,
All the senses
yeah,
engaged, for
all the
sure.
senses engaged.
Yeah.
which I wouldn't have dared. I thought that it was a very, there are very rigid medical things about dying, and that those are the rules. And of course, there is in that the body dies, and you don't want to have a person have any distress at all. But there are ways that are human and spiritual that can complement the medical ending, and that was a huge aha. So grateful to have learned that.
For sure. And, for Tim, he doesn't necessarily like to talk about it, but he shows it in many ways. Like in our garden, he built me a piazza. I said, that's where I go to talk to the ancestors. And so all of his work and his labor and his study about how to build lay bricks and all of that was his grief work for whatever his life brings. And, he says he's not very skilled at grieving. I think he is. I think, he does a lot of work around it.
Yeah, so we're back to that idea of the curiosity and the asking questions about grieving and dying is the antidote to fear around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really think so. And again, you kind of have to, in many cases, you have to have an experience. It doesn't have to be with the death of a loved one, but an experience of nature dying that you're present to, right? The leaves fall every fall. What does that really mean? How do the cycles of life work? And so you can be present to any of those and have the experience. It doesn't have to wait till someone dies.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I'm a gardener. So fall is very much a reflective, sad time, right? Like pulling up all the plants I worked so hard to nurture. Yeah. Gardening is, or nature is, oh my goodness. Nature is amazing. I did want to talk before we go about legacy. What is, when we talk about legacy, what is that? And how do you plan a legacy?
Different for everyone, of course.
Mm-hmm.
When Jamie and I were adding that module on topic to our Crows and Earl program, we were, great on seeing others. And we were like, what is mine? And, Jamie's like, at that time she was, spring chicken. She was like, I don't have a legacy. And she's saying that as she's surrounded by books, English lit degree. That's all she does is read. And it's so funny because Jamie, Tim, and my sister Evie, who's the closest to me in the world, they're all the big readers. I call them my research team because I can't I read, but not like them. Anyway, Jamie's like, and she she writes in all her books, and she writes, oh, this reminds me of so and so. She writes in all the corners of the pages, and it freaks a lot of people out. Anyway, we said, I kind of think your books are your legacy and what you've written in them. If you were to die before me, hopefully not, but if you were, I want one of your books that maybe you mention me in, or at least I can know what you're thinking, and I'll be with you in the moments where the waves are crashing down around me when I'm grieving. And so, yeah, she does it now, writes in the books with much more purpose. And for myself, again, it was this idea of I don't have kids, I'll never be a mother, never be a grandmother, but it's those archetypes, like what is the archetype of a grandmother? And my story is, when I was 9, I got to take ballet lessons, which was a really extravagant thing in our family. I was the only kid who got to take them, and I rubbed that into my siblings' faces all the time. And it's like, oh, I remember that year where I took ballet lessons. And anyway, at the end of the year, we had a performance, and of course, my grandmother used to make all our clothes, mostly out of curtains like the Von Trapp family or tablecloths. But for this final performance, I had to be a butterfly, and my ballet teacher told my mom, she needs chiffon and satin and sequins. And I didn't know what any of those things were, but my grandmother, they got the materials, and we had one of the bedrooms. It was a small house in Capitol Hill in Calgary, and my grandmother used to sew at her kitchen table. And I remember sitting across from her. I would always sit across from her when she would sew, and she made her own patterns. And she was making my butterfly dress, and she was making this out of these fabrics that I had never seen. And all I could think as she's hand stitching the sequence is, she must love me so much. And I still have the ballet dress, of course. And so I bring that to all of our Crows presentations so people can hold it. And so I think part of my legacy is the love of a grandmother, the love of ancestors, and to share that with my next generations that I may or may not get to meet, to be able to say there is so much love behind us and so much love coming through us from the ancestors. It's hard to, it's sometimes so all embracing. It's hard to not be filled up with that. So I think that's my legacy. And so some people write letters, some people think it is all monetary, and it can be, which is great. You've toiled so hard in your life, your work meant so much, and here's what I leave to my people. Absolutely, it can be that, can be lessons learned. So it really is just something that says this is a mark I want to be remembered by, in a way you'll stay connected to me.
I love that. I noticed behind you you've got photos of your ancestors. Is that a way to, to someone who's maybe new to exploring the idea of ancestral love? Like, is that kind of a quick experiment, or how would you, is there a how to vibe with your ancestors tip you have, Janine?
Yeah, I mean, there's the continuum this big, right? You want to study ancestral work, Daniel 4, there's amazing teachers who have studied all over the world, who have courses online. You want to go deep, you can go very deep. You want to tiptoe in? Yeah, look at a picture. Just stare into the eyes of someone in your ancestral line, probably that you didn't know. I would start there. Relationships are complex. I mean, I adored my mom and dad so much, and my grandmother, all flawed like me. And so when you are beginning, you don't want to be focusing on the good, the bad, until you're able to say, and sometimes that's never possible. I understand that. And sometimes forgiveness is not meant to be, it's not healthy for anyone. But at times where you can just see, looking into the eyes and saying, that's part of who I am, and it doesn't have to be carried on, or it's part of who I am, and this is the parts I want to carry on. And so, for our conversation here, you know me, but this conversation, you have met Maria Fantine, my grandmother, how I carry her. You've met Angelina Fantine Violini, my mom, and how I carry her and her work. I think she would have been well known as a death doula. She did 20 years of volunteering at the bedside before death doula was called a thing. My dad, the only regret he had in his career was not being a funeral director. So, I carry all of them in, and that's, hopefully what you've seen in me, the good parts of me are them. And so just imagining what part of this ancestor do I want to carry on in this world, is probably the way to tiptoe in. And I remember after my dad died, it was about 3 years after, I said to my sister Abby, again, the all-knowing and all-wise one in my life, I said, I'm scared I'm starting to forget his laugh. I'm starting to forget his voice. And she wrote the most beautiful email to me that just said, you can't possibly forget him. He's in your cells. He's part of your makeup. And like I say, for people who don't have that biological connection, we have that connection with so many people that they become part of ourselves. And so whoever your family and your ancestral line is, it can be scientific, it can be energetic, it can just be, this is how I want to be in the world because this person taught me that.
I love that. One question I like to ask everyone who's on Secret Heart Broadcasting is about the books they're reading. And I don't know if you have a few you want to talk about or you want to share. I know you've already admitted you have the great readers in your tribe.
According to my research team. Yeah, no. I would say, for me, there's always one book, regardless of what it is. Like for me, in the courses we took, Tuesdays with Maury, old book, but it was like, oh, we are all teaching each other how to die, whether it's what you would call a good death or a peaceful death or a horrible one. It's a teaching, right? And so we are learning from each other about death. And that book was the first one that sort of made me think, oh, how will I teach death? And then probably hospice work. It was Dr. Ira Bioch on Dying Well was the book that sort of shifted things for me. And then in grief, definitely Francis Weller, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and all the books in between. But the one I did bring one today, and I don't know why I was so called to reread this. It was gifted to me, One Drum by Richard Wagamese. And I, it was gifted to me by a family that I worked with. They were going through a transition. It wasn't a death, but we did a lot of ceremony around that big transition. And they gifted it to me. And when I first read it, I think I cried through the whole thing. I just loved it. And I started rereading it again. I said, oh, well, the reason I'm rereading it is because, he speaks of ceremony. And there's a page near the beginning that I think describes, your secret heart just so perfectly. It was like he wrote the definition just for you. And so I thought, oh, I guess that's why I'm reading it again. So, beautiful author, deceased now, but yeah.
It's a gift to reconnect with you again, Janine. And I'm so glad you said yes. And, best of luck to you and Jamie with Crows in a Row. That work is so important. And, I absolutely love that you've got your, Excel spreadsheet corporate life. I mean, you're coming to us now from your corporate office, and the work you're moving toward becomes that, you're becoming more truly who you are in the world with the Crows in a Row work and death education. And how important is that? Wow.
Thank you, Kerrie. Thank you for seeing me and for wanting to talk to me about this. And, I'm always open for this conversation.
Well, I think that's important to know. And I do want to say for people watching today, if you like what you're hearing or seeing, please follow Janine and Jamie, available at crowsinarow.com. And yeah, just to continue that, like the secret sauce in all of this is love, right? It is love.
Yeah.
So yeah, continue to love. And thank you very much for watching. And thank you, Janine, for saying yes today. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please tell your friends.